My father, Frank Carroll, spent 23 years as a high school football coach in western Pennsylvania before retiring to run a sporting goods store with my uncle. He was a man who understood the world through a specific lens: discipline, hierarchy, results you could measure on a scoreboard. He was not without intelligence or love. He loved me in his way through the particular frame of someone who had decided early on what success looked like and measured everything and everyone against that image. His image of success did not include the military. He had not served. His father had not served. The military, in his understanding, was something people chose when they didn't have better options. A path that led to danger without adequate compensation, to sacrifice without adequate recognition, to a career that existed outside the normal structures of advancement he could track and comprehend. When I told him at 18 that I had been accepted to West Point, he sat at the kitchen table and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "There are good state schools that would be glad to have you." I went to West Point. He came to my graduation 4 years later and stood in the crowd and clapped and said the right things. But something had been established in that kitchen table silence that did not resolve at graduation, that would not resolve at any subsequent milestone, a settled belief that I had chosen wrong, and that every achievement I accumulated was an achievement within a framework he did not value rather than evidence that his original assessment needed revising. I want to describe what the following 11 years looked like, because they matter. I commissioned as a second lieutenant in military intelligence. I deployed to Afghanistan twice, once for 9 months, once for 11. Between deployments, I worked in analysis positions at Fort Meade and later at the Pentagon, moving through the ranks with what my performance evaluations consistently described as exceptional judgment under pressure and a rare combination of strategic thinking and operational precision. I made captain at 26, major at 30. I was selected for a fellowship program that placed me in the office of General Raymond Hartley, the Army's Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence, a 4-star general with 40 years of service and a reputation in the intelligence community that I had been aware of for most of my career. The selection was competitive. 18 officers applied from across the Army. 3 were chosen. I was one of them. My role was his aide-de-camp, what the military calls an ad. I coordinated his schedule, managed his briefings, traveled with him, and served as the interface between his office and the rest of the Army's intelligence apparatus. It was the kind of position that required absolute reliability, complete discretion, and the ability to function at the highest levels of institutional complexity without drawing attention to the machinery. I was good at it. General Hartley told me in his characteristically direct way, approximately 3 months into the assignment, "Carol, I don't compliment people for doing their job correctly. But I want you to know that I've had 12 aides in my career and you are in the top 2. I told him I appreciated that. He said, "Don't let it go to your head. Now tell me what you actually think about the Pakistan assessment because the briefing this morning was too optimistic." That was General Hartley. That was the man I worked with every day. That was the man whose schedule I managed, whose briefings I prepared, whose morning I organized from 0545 to whenever the day finally ended. My father did not know any of this, not because I was hiding it. Because he had stopped asking about my career approximately 6 years into my service, when it became clear to both of us that his questions were not genuine inquiries, but openings for the expression of his ongoing disappointment, and that I had run out of patience for converting my actual life into terms that would satisfy his framework. We talked. We talked at Christmas and Thanksgiving and on birthdays. We talked about football and family and the sporting goods store and what was happening with my cousins and aunts and uncles and all the ordinary texture of a family that remained connected despite the distance my career had put between us. We did not talk about my career. My mother, Patricia, knew more. She was the one who called me after deployments, who asked careful questions, who had visited me once at Fort Meade and walked around with the expression of someone genuinely trying to understand a world that was foreign to her. She was proud of me in a way she expressed quietly, in private, in ways she calibrated to not directly contradict my father in his presence. I met my husband, James, at a conference in Washington 3 years ago. He worked in defense contracting, civilian, MBA, deeply familiar with the military world without being in it, and he had the particular quality of someone who could move easily between my professional world and my family world without being destabilized by either. He met my father twice before we got engaged. My father liked him immediately, in the uncomplicated way he liked straightforward men who talked about things he could follow. When James proposed, he said he was happy for me. He said James seemed like a good man. He said he hoped we would be happy. He said, "Maybe now you'll think about settling down somewhere." I told him James and I had talked about it and that we were planning to stay in the DC area. He said, right, because of the job. He said the word job the way you say the word hobby. I let it go. The wedding was in June at a venue outside Annapolis, James's idea, neutral ground, but 112 guests. Military colleagues, family, James's extensive network from the contracting world. A June weekend, warm and clear, the kind of day that makes everything feel uncomplicated. General Hartley had been invited because James and I had both wanted him there. James had met him twice and genuinely liked him. And I had felt, in the way you feel about people who have seen you at your professional best, that his presence at my wedding. He had accepted, which had surprised me slightly, because four-star generals have schedules that rarely accommodate personal commitments for junior officers. He had said, Carol, I wouldn't miss it. You've earned a day off. I had not told my father that General Hartley was coming. Not strategically, I want to be clear about that, because what happened later has a quality that might make it seem calculated, and it wasn't. I hadn't told my father because my father and I didn't discuss my career, and General Hartley was my career in the most direct possible way. The two categories simply didn't intersect in the conversations we had. My father had arrived at the reception before the ceremony was fully over, which was typical of him. He liked being settled before events began, like knowing where the bar was and where the best sight lines were. By the time James and I entered the reception hall as husband and wife, my father had already been there for 20 minutes, had already located James's parents, Richard and Helen, and had already begun what I would later learn was a fairly extensive conversation about our futures. I know what was said in that conversation because James's mother Helen told me about it later that evening, with the careful apology of someone who felt I deserved to know. My father had told Richard and Helen, in the warm, expansive way of a man on his second champagne, that he was glad James had finally found someone to settle down with, that Megan was a wonderful girl even if she'd spent too many years in the military, that he hoped the marriage would give her a reason to think about coming home, that her mother and he had always thought she'd be happier with a more conventional life, that the military was no place for someone with her potential. He said she's a good person, she just made some choices early on that limited her options. I hope James can help her see that it's not too late to course correct. He said this to my new in-laws at my wedding reception. James's mother had smiled and said something noncommittal. James's father, Richard, who had 30 years in defense contracting and who knew exactly what a Pentagon posting meant, had been very quiet. I learned all of this later. What I knew in the moment was what I saw when I entered the reception hall with James. My father was standing near the bar with Richard and Helen and two of James's uncles, talking with the particular animation of a man who has found receptive company. He looked happy. He looked at home. He looked like a man who had been waiting for years to be the father of someone who was doing something he could explain to people. I saw all of that. And then, approximately 40 seconds later, I saw General Raymond Hartley walk through the door. He was in dress blues, 4 stars. The combat infantryman badge, the Distinguished Service Medal, every decoration placed with the precision of someone who has worn a uniform for 40 years. He was 61 years old and he moved through a room the way people move, when rooms have reorganized themselves around their presence for so long that the reorganization. The room noticed him immediately. Military guests came to attention instinctively. Several of James's contracting colleagues visibly straightened. A ripple of awareness moved through the space. My father noticed none of this. He was still talking. General Hartley scanned the room, located me, and walked directly toward me. He shook James's hand first. He had a particular courtesy with spouses that I had observed many times. The acknowledgement that the military asks hard things of families and that the person who said yes to a life alongside it deserved recognition. He said, "Congratulations, son. You've got an exceptional officer here. Don't let her work too hard today." James said, "I'll do my best, sir." Then General Hartley turned to me and said, "Carol, outstanding day." I said, "For 24 hours, sir." He laughed, a short, genuine sound, and then looked past me toward the bar where my father was standing. My father had turned during this exchange. He had seen the uniform, had seen the stars, had seen the way the room had oriented toward this man, and was now watching the conversation with an expression I had never seen on his face before. I turned and said, "General Hartley, I'd like to introduce my father, Frank Carroll." His champagne had become very still. General Hartley shook it. He said, "Frank, Raymond Hartley, your daughter is one of the finest officers I've had the privilege of working with in 40 years. You should be extraordinarily proud." My father said something, I don't remember exactly what, something appropriate. Something that functioned as a response without fully being one. General Hartley said, "She's been my aide for 14 months. In this job you see people at their absolute best and their absolute worst. Carol has never been anything but exceptional. The Army is lucky to have her and so are you." Then he excused himself to find his table. My father stood at the bar with his champagne glass. He looked at me. I looked at him. I did not say anything. There was nothing I needed to say. The moment had already said everything, in terms he could not reframe or qualify or absorb into his existing understanding of what my career amounted to. A 4-star general, 40 years of service, one of the most senior officers in the United States Army. My aide, your daughter is one of the finest officers I've had the privilege of working with in 40 years. My father put his champagne glass down on the bar. He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "You never asked." I took James's hand and we moved toward our table, and the reception continued around us in the warm, uncomplicated way of a June wedding where everything has gone as planned. What happened after the reception, I want to describe carefully, because I think it matters more than the moment at the bar. My father found me at the end of the evening, when the hall was emptying, and James was saying goodbye to his college friends near the door. He found me standing near the window, shoes off, watching the last of the guests move toward their cars. He stood beside me for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "I owe you an apology." I turned to look at him. He said, "I've been telling myself a story about your career for a long time, and it wasn't the right story. I think I knew it wasn't the right story for a while. Tonight just made it impossible to keep telling it." I said, "I know, Dad." He said, "I'm sorry it took me this long. I'm sorry I wasn't paying the right kind of attention." I thought about that for a moment. About West Point and the kitchen table and 11 years of conversations that carefully avoided the center of my life. About my mother calling after deployments. About performance evaluations in the Pentagon and 14 months of 0545 mornings. I said, "I stopped needing you to understand it a long time ago. But I'm glad." He didn't say anything to that. He nodded in the careful way of someone accepting a statement they know they've earned. We stood there at the window for a little while longer. Then James came to find me and we said goodbye to the last guests and left. I want to be honest about what the months since that evening have looked like, because I think stories like this are sometimes told as though a single moment resolves everything, and this one didn't. My father and I have had, since the wedding, 3 conversations about my career that were genuine, actual exchanges in which he asked real questions, and I gave real answers, in which he tried to understand rather than to fit what I told him into a framework he'd already built. They were imperfect conversations. He asked some questions that revealed how little he had been paying attention. I answered some of them with a patience that didn't come entirely naturally. And they were the first real conversations we had had about my work in 11 years. He called me in August to tell me he had looked up General Hartley. He said he had spent an afternoon reading about his career. He said, "I didn't understand what you were doing. I didn't try to understand. I want to start trying." I told him I appreciated that. He said, "That man called you one of the finest officers he's worked with in 40 years. I said, "Yes," he said. I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I missed a lot." I said, "You did." He said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know. General Hartley retired 8 months ago." His retirement ceremony was at the Pentagon in the large auditorium used for events of that significance, flags, dress uniforms, the full ceremonial weight of 40 years of service concluding. I was on the organizing committee. I gave a brief address as part of the ceremony on behalf of the aide-de-camp office that lasted 4 minutes and that I had written and rewritten 6 times because I wanted it to be exactly right. My parents were in the audience. My father's idea. He had called me 6 weeks before the ceremony and asked if it was appropriate for him to attend. I told him it was a public ceremony and he was welcome. He said he wanted to be there. He sat in the 4th row with my mother in his best suit, and he watched the ceremony with the expression of someone who is trying to absorb something large and is willing to take the time required. When I stood at the podium, I did not look for him immediately. I looked at my notes, and then at the room, and then when I had found my footing, I found him in the 4th row. He was sitting very straight. He looked proud. Not the performed pride of someone who has decided to be proud because the situation calls for it. Something quieter and more complicated than that. The look of someone who is catching up, who is seeing something that has been there for a long time and is only now fully visible, and who understands, finally, the weight of what they missed while they were looking elsewhere. I gave my address. I walked back to my seat. Afterward, in the reception that followed the ceremony, my father found me near the coffee station. He didn't say much. He put his hand on my shoulder for a moment, a gesture he had always used when words ran out, and then he said, "You were extraordinary up there." I said, "Thank you, Dad." He said, "I know I'm late. I'm going to keep trying anyway." I told him that was all I needed. I meant it. I am 34 years old. I am married to a man who has never needed me to explain why my career matters. I serve in the United States Army in a posting that I cannot describe in full detail, but that I am proud of every day. I have a father who spent 11 years looking at the wrong picture of me, and who is now, slowly and imperfectly, learning to look at the right one. That is not a complete resolution. It is not the ending of a story so much as the beginning of a different one, a relationship between two adults who are finally, in their own time, having the conversations they should have been having for years. I will take it. What happened at my wedding was not revenge. I want to be clear about that. I did not invite General Hartley to my wedding in order to produce a moment. I invited him because he mattered to me, because James wanted him there, because after 14 months of 0545 mornings and sealed Pentagon briefings and the particular intimacy of working that closely with someone for that long, I wanted him at my wedding. That he walked through the door at the exact moment my father was explaining my limitations to my new in-laws was not our plan. It was just timing. And sometimes timing is its own kind of justice. I stood at that window at the end of the evening and I accepted my father's apology, and I meant what I said, that I had stopped needing him to understand a long time ago. That was true. I had built my career without his understanding, and I had built it well, and the building of it had been its own reward for 11 years. But I will also tell you, because I am trying to be completely honest, it mattered. Standing in that hall and watching a 4-star general walk toward me while my father stood at the bar, it mattered in a way I had told myself it wouldn't, in a way I had spent 11 years training myself not to need. Not the vindication, not the look on my father's face. The fact that General Hartley walked through that door and said what he said and meant every word of it. The fact that the life I had built, quietly and without my father's understanding, was real enough to walk through a door and dress blues and speak for itself. That was enough. That has always been enough. I just didn't know until that evening how much I had been waiting for it to arrive. There are things about that evening I have not told anyone except James, and one thing I have not told even him, which I want to say here because it belongs to the full picture. The thing I have not told James is what happened in the car on the way to our hotel that night. We had been married for approximately 7 hours. James was driving, still in his suit, tie loosened, the particular relaxed happiness of a man who has had a very good day. I was in the passenger seat with my shoes off and my feet on the dashboard, watching the lights of Annapolis through the window. I started crying, not dramatically. Not in a way that required James to pull over or that alarmed him significantly. Just the quiet release valve kind of crying that happens when something you have been holding for a long time finally finds its way out. James reached across and took my hand without asking what was wrong, which was one of the 1,000 reasons I had married him. After a minute or two he said, "Is it the good kind or the complicated kind?" I said, "Both." He said, "Okay." He kept driving. I thought about the kitchen table when I was 18. About the silence that followed when I told my father about West Point. About the way that silence had settled into the architecture of our relationship and stayed there year after year, present in every conversation about everything except the thing that mattered most. I thought about Afghanistan. About the 9 months and then the 11 months and the things that happened in both that I have not described here, and will not describe here, because some things belong only to the people who were there. About coming home each time to a father who asked how I was doing and accepted the surface answer, and moved quickly to something he felt more equipped to discuss. I thought about Fort Meade and the Pentagon and 14 months of 0545 mornings, and what it had cost, and what it had given me, and how none of those costs and gifts had ever fully made it into a conversation with my father. And I thought about the look on his face. Not the look at the bar when General Hartley shook his hand. The look later, at the window. The look that wasn't performed and wasn't about saving face, and wasn't about any of the things my father's facial expressions had usually been about in conversations about my career. That look was real. It was the look of a man who was seeing something for the first time that had been there all along, and who understood in that moment the specific shape of what he had missed. I cried for about 10 minutes in the passenger seat of our rental car, on the way to our wedding night hotel. Then I stopped and looked at James and said, "Okay, I'm done." He said, "You sure?" I said, "For tonight." He said, "We can come back to it." I said, "I know. We have come back to it. Not in one long conversation, but in the incremental way that things get processed when they are genuinely large. A comment here, a moment there, the kind of ongoing revisitation that happens when something important has changed, and both people in a relationship are still working out what the change." James had his own reaction to the evening that he shared with me gradually over the weeks that followed. He had been aware, going into the wedding, that my relationship with my father around my career was complicated. He had not fully understood the depth of it until he heard, from his own mother, what my father had said at the reception bar while I was still at the altar. He was angry on my behalf in a way that was quieter and more sustained than immediate anger, the kind that settles in and doesn't leave quickly. He didn't express it toward my father directly. He understood, with the emotional intelligence that had been part of why I married him, that my father's relationship with me was mine to navigate. But he held it. What changed his anger, I think, was the window conversation. He had been across the room when it happened, but he saw it, the two of us standing there, my father's hand on my shoulder, the brief exchange that resolved nothing and acknowledged everything. He told me later that watching my father attempt accountability, however imperfectly and however late, had moved something in him. He said, "I thought about what it costs a person to say I was wrong to someone they should have been saying it to for 11 years. It doesn't undo any of it." "But it's not nothing." I said, "No, it's not nothing. There is a photograph from my wedding that I keep on my desk at work. It is not the standard wedding photograph, not James and me at the altar, not the first dance, not the cutting of the cake. It is a photograph that one of James's cousins took without planning to, capturing something she noticed and pointed her phone at instinctively. It is a photograph of General Hartley shaking my father's hand. My father's face in the photograph is extraordinary, not in the way faces are extraordinary in planned photographs, but in the way faces are extraordinary when they are doing something the person is not performing, when the expression is simply the external evidence of an interior state that has no defense prepared. He looks like a man who has just understood something he should have understood a long time ago. I look like a woman who has been waiting, without fully knowing she was waiting for exactly this. I have showed that photograph to exactly two people outside my marriage, my mother, who cried, and General Hartley himself, who looked at it for a long moment and then said, "Carol, your father looks like a man who just got outranked by his own daughter." I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Good, it was time." Then he handed the photograph back and told me to get back to work. I am 34 years old. I am a major in the United States Army. I am married to a man who reached across a car console on our wedding night and took my hand without asking what was wrong. I have a father who is learning, 11 years late and one wedding reception at a time, to look at the right picture of who I am. I have a career that walked through a door in dress blues and spoke for itself in front of the people who needed to hear it most. And I have a photograph on my desk that I look at sometimes, not often, not as a trophy, not as a reminder of a victory, but as a reminder of something more specific and more important. A reminder that the life you build without someone's understanding is still a life, that it accumulates, that it becomes real regardless of whether anyone who should have been paying attention was actually paying attention. That sometimes, if you do the work and build the thing and stay in the room long enough, the evidence walks through the door on its own. You don't have to arrange it, you just have to be there when it arrives. I was there. I will keep being there. That is the whole of what any of this has ever required.